She's the hottest date in town. Together, they're love on wheels in Roller Boogie.
Welcome to episode 53 of the Horror Double Bill, the podcast where nearly every week we pair two movies to create something greater than the sum of their parts. I'm Craig Johnson, and this week we are off to Hollywood with two films that explore the horrors of the silver screen, from obsessive fandom and fantasy to the darkest depths of ambition. First up, we have Fade to Black from 1980. This was written and directed by Vernon Zimmerman and stars Dennis Christopher, Tim Thomerson, Linda Kerridge and Eve Brent. Then we jump forward to 2014 and Starry Eyes, written and directed by Kevin Kölsch and Dennis Widmyer. This stars Alexandra Essoe, Amanda Fuller, Noah Segan and Fabianne Therese. Along the way, we'll be discussing the career of producer Irwin Yablans, depictions of Hollywood in the horror film directors Kevin Kölsch and Dennis Widmyer, and much, much more. But before we do any of that though, as always, I'd just like to mention the key sources I've used in researching this week's episode, and all sources will of course be listed or linked in the show notes. So when discussing Fade to Black, I have referred to the book The Man Who Created Halloween by Irwin Yablans, interviews and extras on the Blu-ray special edition of the movie from 88 Films, the book Falling to Pieces, The Rise and Fall of the Slasher Film by Adam Rockoff, and interviews on the websites latimes.com, itcamefromblog.com, and dreadcentral.com. And when discussing Starry Eyes, I have referred to several interviews with the directors, cast, and crew that are available on YouTube and will be linked in the show notes, as well as interviews on the websites brokehorrorfan.com, fangoria.com, sci-fi-now.co.uk, anthemmagazine.com, thehollywoodnews.com, thewolfmancometh.com, and flickfeast.co.uk. And as always, I have also referred to the IMDb and Wikipedia pages for the movies, writers, cast, and crew. Producer Irwin Yablans holds a significant role in horror history. As the producer behind Halloween, he not only came up with the basic concept, but it was also his idea to set the film on Halloween night, thus gifting the movie its title. The success of Halloween gave rise to the slasher film as we know it, crystallizing the tropes that would define the subgenre, including a significant date setting, a past misdemeanor, the subjective camera, and of course the final girl. Although these had already been seen in horrors before, and in several of the films we've discussed so far in this series, Halloween synthesized them to perfection, and so it's fair to say that without this film, and without Irwin Yablans, the American slasher, had it ever emerged at all, would have been very, very different. He was born in Brooklyn, New York in July 1934, during the Great Depression. As such, he grew up in relative poverty, although this was little different to everyone around him. In his autobiography, he said that this seemed like a natural condition because everyone he knew was at least as badly off as he and his family. He grew up during World War II and turned to cinema for escapism, recalling that the kids in his neighborhood would go to the movies after eating Sunday dinner and that there were 3 picture houses across the street. With each showing a double feature, a chapter of an episodic serial, and cartoons, each Sunday afternoon was dedicated to cinema, setting a foundation for what would turn into a lifelong career in film distribution and production, although this was still a far way off. Dropping out of high school, he began working in the shipping department of a knitwear company, and then began a range of similar jobs in the garment industry, a profession into which he was followed by his younger brother Frank, who would himself go on to work in film production. Irwin then moved on to working in an iron foundry before undertaking 2 years military service, after which he got a job in the New York offices of Warner Brothers, starting off as an apprentice booker. Of this time, he later said, quote, "I spent most of my working life in the movie business, doing just about everything, from loading trucks for Warner Brothers in New York to sales work around the country from branch to branch. This was back in the days when motion picture companies had offices in every city and they distributed movies physically, so we had cans of film that we delivered to theatres." End quote. And this, of course, is something that we see in Fade to Black, with protagonist Eric Binford working in a similar industry. Hardly surprising, perhaps, given that, much like Halloween before it, the basic story of the film would come from Yablans himself. Eventually moving to Paramount Pictures and California, he became the youngest major studio branch manager in LA, and over time he rose through the ranks, moving laterally into sales. Once again, he was followed into this profession by his brother Frank, who eventually overtook him to first become VP of General Sales and then eventually president of Paramount Pictures. Meanwhile, Irwin moved over into production. The first film he produced was The Education of Sonny Carson, a quote-unquote blaxploitation picture released in 1974. This had an incredibly troubled shoot, with Irwin himself writing in his autobiography that, quote, "The entire New York film community was making a book on whether we would get this picture finished." But finish it they did, although despite some very positive reviews, including Variety, the film did very little in the way of box office. Shortly after this, his brother Frank was removed from his role as the head of Paramount, something that was possibly prompted by an interview he gave to New York magazine in which he was less than complimentary about the Paramount chairman. And with Frank deposed as president, the name Yablans suddenly became a dirty word at the studios. Unsurprisingly, Irwin was asked to clear his desk as well. Moving into independent distribution, Yablans set up a company called Compass International Pictures with his business partner Joseph Wolfe. And here, as he put it, all of his experience at these studios came to good use. Quote, "I functioned as sales manager, publicity and advertising director, and became, by sheer necessity, head of production. Using the Hollywood Reporter and Variety as conduits, I made regular announcements of activities and future plans. We may have been poor, but in an industry where perception was everything, I was determined to create the impression that Compass was a viable supplier of films." End quote. The strategy paid off. One day he received a call from talent agent Phil Kölsch, who was representing a young filmmaker called John Carpenter. Carpenter had just completed a feature titled Siege, which had received little interest from the major studios, and Kölsch was wondering whether Yablans would be interested in seeing the film and potentially acting as distributor. Yablans was incredibly impressed with Siege and believed it could be a big success, but he wasn't impressed by the title and suggested that it should be changed to something with more commercial appeal, Assault on Precinct 13. And with the name changed, he created a print campaign, a trailer, and set openings in New York and LA, as well as booking the film into theatres across the country. As we've discussed previously, Assault on Precinct 13 was not very well received in the States, but Yablans had also agreed foreign distribution rights. Travelling to a film fair in Milan, he was approached by a man called Michael Myers, who wanted to secure the British film distribution rights from him and to screen it at the London Film Festival later that year. For $20,000, a deal was struck, and Assault on Precinct 13 turned out to not only be the critical darling of the London Film Festival, but also performed incredibly well at cinemas, first across the UK and then across Europe. Yablans, who had ambitions to move Compass from distribution into full production, realised two things. Firstly, that he wanted Carpenter to direct their first in-house production, and secondly, that to secure this, with Carpenter's star on the rise, he had to act quickly. And so with this in mind, he began to think of a premise that would attract the talents of the young Carpenter, work within a limited budget, and also preferably have a built-in audience. Having long been fascinated by horror, he realised that the genre certainly fit the last two categories, and the idea came to him that a story about babysitters in peril might have a wide appeal, reasoning that everybody has either been a babysitter, hired one, or, at the very least, has been babysat themselves. With a restricted budget, the premise would also allow him to set the story on one night and use limited locations, which would also help to create a claustrophobic atmosphere. Suddenly, he said, he had a eureka moment. Why not set his horror movie on the night that celebrates fear itself, Halloween? Quote, "But I thought to myself, I bet somebody's already done it. I bet the title has been used. But on researching as much as I could, I learned that not only had the word Halloween not been used for a movie title, it hadn't even been used as part of a movie title in the history of cinema." End quote. The rest, as they say, is horror history. Halloween went on to become one of the most influential horrors of all time, its popularity leading to a wave of imitations, all of which built on the tropes synthesized by Yablans and Carpenter. The slasher movie had well and truly arrived. Following Halloween, Compass's next film was 1979's Tourist Trap, on which they acted as distributor, with Yablans taking the role of executive producer. Taking a nod from the backwoods horror of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, this features a group of teenagers who get stranded near a rural tourist trap haunted by mannequins and dummies, and a killer with a gift for telekinesis. Though it received relatively poor reviews at the time of its release, it did manage to gross $4 million against a budget of $350,000, and has gone on to become something of a cult classic. Indeed, in 2024, a remake of the movie was announced by Alliance Media Partners, and is due to be produced by horror star Barbara Crampton. With 2 horror successes under his belt, one might have assumed that his next productions would also be horror films, but this was not the case. Well, not quite anyway. In 1979, the same year as Tourist Trap, Yablans produced a horror disco comedy, yes really, called Nocturna, in which the granddaughter of Count Dracula is seduced by the lure of disco music. In the same year, he also developed and released another disco-themed movie, the truly appalling Roller Boogie, one of the many films in which Linda Blair tried to shake off the legacy of The Exorcist. Despite universally negative reviews from the press, who called it the dopiest movie of the year, Roller Boogie was a box office success, grossing over $13 million and chalking up another success for Compass International. As someone once said, "You'll never get poor by underestimating the taste of the general public." By now, the slasher movie had exploded in popularity, with films like When a Stranger Calls, Terror Train, Prom Night, and Friday the 13th, all chasing after the box office initiated by Halloween. Given that 2 of these movies starred Halloween leading lady Jamie Lee Curtis, Yablans referred to such films as quote-unquote obvious steals from his and Carpenter's work, and once joked about suing the producers. But at the same time, he was already planning his next move, one that would thankfully take him away from the world of disco dancing and roller skates and into an environment that he knew best, the world of cinema. All of which brings us on to our first film of the week, which is Fade to Black, released in 1980. This was written and directed by Vernon Zimmerman from an original idea by Irwin Yablans, and stars Dennis Christopher, Tim Thomerson, Linda Kerridge, and Eve Brent. And now we are getting into the spoilers, and there's a fair amount I'm spoiling in this one, so if you have yet to see Fade to Black, as always, please approach with all due care and attention from this point forward. Fade to Black tells the story of Eric Binford, a put-upon employee of a film distribution company who one day snaps and begins to enact his revenge on those who have wronged him, all in the style of his favourite films. Of his inspiration, Yablans said, quote, "I just sat down one day and I thought about the ultimate film buff. I thought about what he would do, and it just seemed natural that he would want to seek out revenge on people by using all of his movie heroes." End quote. And that is indeed exactly what happens in the film, with young Eric, played by Dennis Christopher, emulating Dracula, the Mummy, and most spectacularly, James Cagney as the gangster Cody Jarrett from the 1949 film noir White Heat. This premise allows for an endless number of film references and Easter eggs to delight any lover of classic cinema, while also allowing for some intriguing subtext about the nature of fandom and the role of movies in inspiring violence. Although it's often labelled a slasher, it's actually far more of a character study of a troubled and bullied young man, and as such it probably has more in common with Brian De Palma's Carrie than it does with Halloween and its many clones. In fact, there's probably a good argument as to whether it's actually a horror movie at all. Screenwriter and director Vernon Zimmerman certainly didn't seem to think it was, saying as much in multiple interviews given at the time of the film's release. Zimmerman was hired to write and direct the film on the recommendation of co-producers George Braunstein and Ron Hamady, and although the relationship between he and Yablans began promisingly, it would certainly deteriorate over the production of the film. A graduate of art house cinema, Zimmerman made his debut in 1962 with a short film titled Lemon Hearts, starring underground movie actor Taylor Mead, who would go on to work in New York with Andy Warhol. Zimmerman had also collaborated with Terrence Malick, directing his first feature, Deadhead Miles, from Malick's first screenplay, and he also wrote the screenplay for the 1973 Western horror Hex, which we discussed briefly back in episode 44. Of their first meeting, Yablans has recalled that Zimmerman initially seemed perfect for the job, saying that he not only clearly knew a lot about classic cinema, but that he also seemed rather similar to the central character of Eric Binford, obsessed with film and both quiet and undemonstrative. More than that, it seemed like he got the idea right away, and he very quickly agreed to both write and direct. Unfortunately, though, it soon transpired that Zimmerman was, according to the producer at least, in over his head, and once filming began, Yablans found himself devoting a significant amount of his own time to completing the picture. That Zimmerman found Yablans' interference frustrating is something of an understatement. The relationship between the two became rather toxic. They clashed repeatedly during production, and Yablans later said that Zimmerman quit once filming was completed and that he ended up editing the picture himself. And even once the movie was completed, there was yet more disagreement, with Zimmerman contacting the Screenwriters Guild to ensure that Yablans, who was not a guild member, wouldn't receive any story credit. As I say, it was rather toxic. Although Fade to Black is centred on Eric Binford, intriguingly the film was more or less designed around its leading lady, an actress by the name of Linda Kerridge, who bore a remarkable resemblance to Marilyn Monroe. According to Kerridge, Yablans and Zimmerman saw her one day outside Schwab's drugstore in LA, and noting the resemblance, asked her if she wanted to be in movies. However, this does seem a rather apocryphal story, particularly given that Schwab's drugstore was where actress Lana Turner was reportedly discovered, and it's far more likely that the introduction took place at a party in London a year before production began. But regardless of when and how it occurred, this initial meeting certainly added a key element to the story, making it not just about a young man who idolizes cinema, but also about his obsession with a woman who happens to look like the most iconic Hollywood star of all time. And Kerridge was certainly right for the role, not just in terms of looks, but also life experience. Born in Australia in 1954, she initially began working as a model, where her resemblance to Monroe was constantly highlighted. She cultivated the similarity by bleaching her hair, creating an image to both hide behind and also help her get ahead. And this it definitely did, helping her find work in London and Paris, where she appeared as Marilyn in a French TV series. And so, by the time she came to shoot Fade to Black, she already knew enough about Monroe to play her in the fantasy sequences, and having lived the early part of her adult life in Marilyn's shadow, could also bring that experience to the character. The casting of Linda Kerridge was also fortuitous in another respect. It was she who originally suggested actor Dennis Christopher for the role of Binford, a decision that, without question, elevates the film out of the ordinary and to which Fade to Black owes its longevity. Dennis Christopher was born in Philadelphia in 1950 and made his screen debut in 1967 in an uncredited performance in the TV series The Time Tunnel. Following this, he appeared in a succession of minor roles, including the 1971 proto-slasher Blood and Lace. After this, a chance encounter with the Italian director Federico Fellini led to his being cast as a hippie in the film Roma in 1972, after which he began working as an assistant to the fashion designer Halston. He resumed his acting career in 1976 with more minor roles, but he got his big breakthrough in 1979 with a film called Breaking Away. This coming-of-age drama, which co-starred Dennis Quaid, earned multiple nominations and awards, including winning the 1979 Oscar for Best Original Screenplay and the Golden Globe Award for Best Film, Comedy or Musical. Importantly for Christopher, it also won him the 1979 BAFTA for Most Promising Newcomer and a Golden Globe nomination for New Star of the Year. Following Linda Kerridge's recommendations, Yablans sent Christopher the script, though it's fair to say he was not particularly impressed, calling it incredibly flawed and saying no to it immediately. But something about the character stayed with him, particularly the idea of playing all of the different characters that Eric adopts, as well as the challenge of making a multiple murderer sympathetic to the audience. He later said, quote, "I couldn't get it out of my mind, and then the money kept rising every time I said no. It was almost like a game on my part, but it finally happened, and I just set my teeth into the character. I felt it was a personal responsibility to elevate as much as I could about the script, so it wasn't a slasher movie, and it wasn't a horror movie, and so that it was a psychological study about cinema worship," end quote. And elevate the material he most certainly did. More than just playing the part as written, Dennis Christopher was instrumental in creating the finished movie, suggesting significant changes to the narrative, working with the other actors on their characterization, creating his own costumes, and even helping to dress the sets. It may have been Irwin Yablans' original idea and Zimmerman's screenplay, but if Fade to Black belongs to anyone, it belongs to Dennis Christopher. Irwin Yablans said of his casting that they were incredibly lucky to have him, not just in terms of a name to attach to the project, but also because of the creativity and commitment that he brought to set. As Christopher himself later said, quote, "There was very little sleep. A lot seemed to be riding on it. Irwin Yablans was my champion because he wanted to make a really good movie. He was really dedicated to making this a better movie than what was on the page. Vernon seemed to have been beaten down by everyone who wanted to change the script to get it going, and I kept trying to validate his ideas. I pushed things through and I made things happen that, without a bit of a fight, would never have happened. And I'm proud of every one of the things that I fought for." End quote. As the film opens, we hear the sound of James Cagney delivering dialogue from the 1931 movie The Public Enemy, hinting not only at Eric's later obsession with Cagney, but also alluding quite literally to what Eric himself will become. As the credits fade, we find ourselves in Eric's bedroom as he circles listings in the TV guide, hinting at an obsession that quickly becomes apparent as the camera pans around the room and we see walls of posters and movie memorabilia. This decoration was one of the things that Christopher fought for, as he was rather appalled to find that the original set had only 3 film posters on the wall, recalling, quote, "I said, that's it. This is the citadel of a boy who lives for the movies. Who lives for the movies? Are you serious? So I had my assistant go home and get every movie magazine that I had, and I cut out all those pictures that you see in the film." End quote. These pictures not only reflect Eric's cinematic obsessions, but also at points act as commentary for the narrative, from the poster for Hitchcock's Frenzy that plasters the back of the bedroom door, to the one sheet for the Hammer movie The Psychopath, which appears briefly in the background after Eric slips into madness. This is certainly a film for those with an eye for detail. There are also nods to Yablans' previous movies, Halloween and Tourist Trap, hanging in the office of Eric's workplace. And when Marilyn sits dejectedly waiting for Eric after missing their date, the marquee on the cinema behind her bears the legend "Never Close." With his obsessive behaviour and hermit-like existence, I suppose these days one might call Eric an incel. While he may be missing the rampant misogyny, though more on that later, his social alienation, poor self-image and mental health issues certainly indicate this to be the case. Lighting a cigarette immediately on waking, with an overflowing ashtray next to him, and swigging on a can of Dr. Pepper, it is clear that his physical as well as his mental well-being is in question. And this is something that we see further evidenced by his constant stomach issues and the fact that his regular lunch order is apparently 2 chocolate donuts, a hot dog with the works, large fries, and a Coke. His slovenly attitude towards life is certainly frowned upon by his Aunt Stella, who bursts into his room in her wheelchair, telling him that if he doesn't mend his ways, he'll be dead before he reaches 30. She is played monstrously well by Eve Brent, who would go on to win a Saturn Award for Best Supporting Actress for her performance. No stranger to the ups and downs of Hollywood herself, Brent had already achieved a small amount of Hollywood fame as Jane in the 1950s Tarzan movies, and this legacy of past glories adds an extra dimension to her performance. Wheeling herself into his room, blaring swing music from the radio, and hitting the furniture repeatedly with a walking stick, Aunt Stella immediately recalls the hagsploitation horrors of Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, something further amplified by her failure to make it big as a performer, a failure for which she quite clearly blames Eric. Saying that she never imagined he would be such a trial when she took him in following the death of his quote-unquote sweet mother, Aunt Stella mourns the loss of her sister and also her squandered talent, though, as we later discover, she is in fact talking about herself. Quote, "Your mother was beautiful, a great talent, Hollywood was at her feet, important men were begging to marry her. Then she met your father, that bastard, and that was the end of our dance team." End quote. She then goes on to blame Eric for the accident that ended her mobility and her dance career, which we infer was caused when Eric's babysitter called her to leave a party and come home. Given that Eric was only 4 at the time, this seems more than a little unreasonable, and indicates that for at least 20 years she has been singing the same tune, blaming the boy for all of her losses in life, while mourning a career that never was. And sadly, and incredibly uncomfortably, there is also far more than this, as we later discover an incestuous relationship between she and Eric. Before his date with Marilyn, he asks her for a loan at the quote-unquote usual rate of interest, and she sneeringly advises him to come home early as she wants her back rub delivered that very evening. It's an incredibly unpleasant moment from an incredibly unpleasant character, and the fact that we later discover that Stella is not his aunt, but is in fact his mother, only adds to the viewer's unease. Given this upbringing, it's no wonder that Eric is as damaged as he is, and you can hardly blame him for his fantasies about smashing a grapefruit into her face at breakfast, emulating a scene from James Cagney's Public Enemy in the first blatant cinematic reference of the film. The use of classic film footage to signpost Eric's internal thoughts is a central motif of the movie and highlights his growing inability to distinguish fantasy from reality. As well as the Public Enemy, we have clips from The Creature from the Black Lagoon, Kiss of Death, and any number of film reels featuring Jimmy Cagney. Most notable is the 1949 movie White Heat, which provides the film's ending, as well as Eric's obsession with the movie's central character, Cody Jarrett. One of cinema's first psychologically tortured gangsters, Cody Jarrett in White Heat is not only dangerously psychotic, but also has delusions of grandeur and an Oedipal relationship with his mother. And so the choice of this character is as much a commentary on Eric's character as it is his obsession with cinema. We then follow Eric to work at a film distribution company which acts as his corner of Hollywood. Even his booth is decorated with a sign bearing the legend Binford Studio. Here we meet his boss, Marty Berger, played by Norman Burton, and his co-workers Bart and Richie, played respectively by Henon Chambers and Mickey Rourke in a very early screen role. From these interactions, it becomes apparent that his work life is as bad as that at home, and that he is also, if we're being honest, not very good at his job. We also learn that his boss has a heart condition, not that it stops him from losing his temper, and this is something that will become important later. From here, we are introduced to 2 new characters, opening up the double narrative that will continue through the rest of the film. These are Dr. Jerry Moriarty, a social worker played by actor and comedian Tim Thomerson, and police officer Anne Oceanball, played by Gwyn Guilford, who, at the time of filming, was pregnant with her son, the actor Chris Pine. Their involvement in the story allows us to follow the police investigation into Eric's eventual crimes, but they also serve as the mouthpieces for one of the movie's central conceits, whether cinema itself is to blame for off-screen violence. This is a debate that would lead to no small amount of moral panic in the years following the film's release, and is first raised by Moriarty following a sexual encounter between he and Oceanball. After emerging from the sheets with a box of Ritz crackers and a beer in his hand, what a catch, Moriarty bemoans the fact that kids today are surrounded by violence, and he and Oceanball exchange stories about a girl who shot her neighbour because she saw it on TV, and a teen who stabbed their friend 22 times for the very same reason. Personally, I wish they'd left it there, as the one flaw for me in the film is the sledgehammer approach to this topic, which is delivered with all of the nuance of a kick in the face, particularly in the lines given to Thomerson. He's a very good actor and provides some comedic moments to counter the film's increasing darkness, but I doubt that any performer, regardless of calibre, would be able to convincingly deliver some of the too-on-the-nose lines he is given. And this is particularly true of the film's climax, where he tries to convince his superiors that Eric is, quote-unquote, a victim of society. After placing a bet with Mickey Rourke's Richie as to the full name of Rick in the movie Casablanca, Eric makes his way to a 1950s-inspired roadside diner, and it is here that we first learn about the stomach ulcer-inducing nature of his regular lunch, and also where he first meets Marilyn, played, as I mentioned earlier, by Linda Kerridge. We've already met Marilyn earlier in the movie, in a largely improvised scene jogging down the beach with her friend Stacy, and her inclusion in the film adds to the themes of obsession and delusion. Her character's name Marilyn cannot be her actual real name, suggesting that she has chosen it herself in a bid to emulate her famous namesake. With her mannerisms designed to do the same, it is clear that she is just as deluded as Eric, and while she is clearly not as dangerous to others, the fact that her obsession leads to her being drugged and nearly dying at the climax suggests that she is at least a danger to herself. And so, for much of the film, particularly their interactions with each other, we can say that Eric and Marilyn are playing at pretend, he adopting various personas and she adopting the persona of the most famous film star of all time, suggesting two very lonely people who cannot ever really be themselves, even with each other. Kerridge's presence also gives the film a strange meta-commentary, a model-turned-actress who made her name impersonating Marilyn Monroe, playing a model-turned-actress who impersonates Marilyn Monroe, who herself felt that she was hiding behind a created persona. The conversation that Marilyn and her friend Stacy are engaged in at the diner is also very telling, a story about a would-be actress who took her own life after missing out on fame. It's a throwaway line which suggests that Hollywood is littered with the corpses of thwarted ambition, underlining the theme introduced by Aunt Stella's monologue in the opening sequence. The scene in the diner allows for some rather humorous intercutting of footage from Creature from the Black Lagoon, and also provides the first out-and-out fantasy moment of the movie. This is with Eric imagining, or hallucinating, Marilyn recreating the famed moment when her namesake sang Happy Birthday for President John F. Kennedy, but it was originally intended to be rather different. The original plan was to have a musical number inspired by the movie Gentlemen Prefer Blondes. However, budgetary restraints meant that they settled for Happy Birthday instead. I have to say, I think this is a bit of a shame. Although the scene works perfectly well, I can't help but think that a musical number so early in the film would have been more impressive, and this is coming from somebody who pretty much hates musicals. If nothing else, it would have given the first half of the movie an even greater Walter Mitty feel, and have us rooting for Eric all the more. Because here's the thing, we like Eric, initially at least. We feel sorry for him, and we also want him to get the girl. Something that briefly appears to be promised when he offers Marilyn a ride on his scooter and tells her that, quote, "Someday I'm going to own my own movie theatre and I'm going to show whatever film I want whenever I want, and you can come," end quote. Scenes like these make his transformation into a killer all the more disturbing and also set up some interior conflict in the viewer. Because while the things he does are admittedly awful, I can't be the only person who kind of roots for him, if for no other reason than all of his victims are uniformly awful people. The first of these is, of course, Aunt Stella, and it has to be said, she certainly has it coming. This happens after Eric's disastrous first date with Marilyn, when she stands him up to go for dinner with her co-worker Joey, who is played by Peter Horton from 1984's Children of the Corn. Before the date, there is another Easter egg for fans of Miss Monroe, as we see Eric getting ready by impersonating the actor Cary Grant. Grant co-starred with Marilyn in one of her early films, Monkey Business, but I think the inclusion of him here is actually more of a nod to her film Some Like It Hot, where Tony Curtis seduces her character Sugar Cane by doing a spot-on Cary Grant impression. It's a subtle nod, but in my opinion, it's there nonetheless. In the original screenplay, Marilyn did actually stand up Eric altogether, presenting her as a rather more uncaring character. However, this was changed through rehearsals to have her simply lose track of time and then go looking for him, making her far more sympathetic than originally intended. This entire sequence, filmed guerrilla style on the streets of Los Angeles, has shades of film noir in the way that Eric wanders sadly through the streets, and it also acts as a time capsule for LA of the 1980s, from the people waiting outside the movie theatre to the party van that drives past the camera. It's all very tragic, and it's all rather moving. That is until Eric encounters a sex worker and has an uncomfortable interaction which, coming on the heels of the incest revelations, make him look far more pathetic and also far darker than we may have first thought. This then brings us to the first murder, inspired by the 1947 film noir Kiss of Death. To be fair to Eric, though, he doesn't completely copy Richard Widmark by forcibly pushing Stella down the stairs. It's just that he doesn't exactly do anything to stop it either, giving a gentle push and then letting the defective wheelchair do the work. This again was a change from the script, where the killing was far more intentional and was suggested by Dennis Christopher, who wanted the first murder to seem less of a willful act. Another change he initiated was the final shot after Stella's death, requesting that the camera pan upward to show Eric completely giving in to insanity. The death of Aunt Stella acts as the break in Eric's persona, demonstrated through an excellent shot of his reflection captured by two mirrors as he breaks down in the bathroom. From here on in, he fully adopts the persona of Cody Jarrett from White Heat, changing his name on the mailbox and even the street sign to fit more fully with his cinematic inspiration. He also eliminates any reminder of Aunt Stella, leading to a humorous scene of book burning where the titles from her library are revealed as including Prunes for Health and Carrots Can Make You Well. But despite these efforts, Aunt Stella is not gone altogether. Later in the film, he begins speaking with her, echoing both Norman Bates in Psycho and, of course, Cody Jarrett in White Heat, revealing that he was possibly far more psychologically dependent on her than we first imagined. Dual nature of Eric's personality is further demonstrated soon after by the most famous shot of the movie, where he applies the makeup for his Dracula costume, with one half of his face painted and the other left untouched. This is a costume for a screening of Night of the Living Dead, leading to an amusing moment where the fully costumed Eric barely stands out from the crowd of other cinema goers. This also allows for further explanation of the theme of whether cinema is to blame for violence, and features Eric getting a little too caught up in the infamous matricide sequence, which is a possible callback to the death of Aunt Stella. Originally, the movie to be screened in this scene was Psycho, but this was changed as they went into filming, which may have been a creative decision, but was probably more likely influenced by budgetary restrictions. It has to be said, though, that last-minute choice or not, Night of the Living Dead does seem a far more appropriate option, given that its original release led to calls for the Supreme Court to establish guidelines for the quote-unquote pornography of violence, and so its inclusion here certainly speaks to the film's underpinning theme. There is, however, a missed opportunity here, or at least there is in my opinion. Disturbed by the conversation from another cinema goer, Eric becomes clearly annoyed, and on first viewing I erroneously assumed that they were to be his next victim. Sadly, though, this is not the case, and the annoying movie patron lives to ruin another film for somebody else another day. Like I say, a missed opportunity, and certainly something that would have earned a round of applause from my section of the audience, though silently, of course. After leaving the cinema, Eric makes an unfortunate house call to Marilyn's apartment, which, as well as allowing for a shower scene homage to Psycho, also depicts his shift from lovesick admirer to stalker, showing how far removed from reality he is becoming. Despite his protest that he only wanted her autograph, one does have to wonder what exactly he was hoping would happen when she found Dracula waiting behind the shower curtain? Was he thinking that she would laugh? Was he hoping that she would scream? What exactly were his plans? It's doubtful that even he knows, or indeed that he had even thought that far ahead. We now come to his second killing, that of the sex worker who verbally abused him after his failed first date, and this too was another change to the script. In the original screenplay, Eric was to have killed her deliberately, but this was changed, again at Dennis Christopher's suggestion, to become an accidental death, with Eric's attempt to frighten her leading to a tragic outcome. This certainly allows for a greater degree of audience sympathy than were he to be a cold-blooded killer from the outset, though how much sympathy we feel when he begins to drink her blood is certainly questionable. This change has led several online commentators to note that the order of deaths in the film seems somewhat displaced. According to them, because the sex worker's death is accidental and the later killing of Marty Berger is, if not entirely accidental, then a byproduct of Eric's behaviour, the cold-blooded killing of next victim Richie seems rather out of order. It has to be said that they do have a point, and Eric's downfall would perhaps have been more sharply defined had the killings of Richie and Berger been switched, allowing for a trajectory from impulse to accident to out-and-out deliberate cold-blooded murder. But given that the sex worker killing was rewritten at the last minute, it's possibly understandable that this wasn't really considered. That being said, the next killing, that of Richie, is a brilliantly executed sequence, if you'll forgive the pun. Here, Eric dresses as a cowboy, Hopalong Cassidy, a character played in the movies by an actor called William Boyd. In those movies, Cassidy was often called on to intercede when dishonest characters took advantage of honest citizens. Richie, of course, has most certainly done this, so the choice of costume is a very apt one, even if it did later cause a few problems. As mentioned earlier, Richie is played by Mickey Rourke in a very early role before his breakout in Diner, which was released in 1982. Although given his life trajectory, it is hard to believe now that he was once a serious actor with a background in method acting, this was most certainly the case, and he certainly employed this approach to filming. The moment when he asks a passerby where he is quote-unquote hiding all the pussy was an improvisation involving a real bystander, and the moment of his death was also largely improvised, though it has to be said, this was more at the behest of Dennis Christopher than it was Mickey Rourke's. Eric making Richie get down on his knees was not in the screenplay, and Christopher only introduced it in the rehearsal directly before filming, much to Rourke's annoyance. Despite his co-star's protests, Christopher kept the moment in for the actual filming and even took it a step further, telling him to get down on both knees before pulling the trigger. So, in this sense, we could say that Rourke's facial reaction to these instructions is more genuine bafflement and annoyance than it is anything else. This killing leads to Eric finally coming into the orbit of the police and Dr. Moriarty, who introduces an unauthorized questionnaire into the investigation, and which reveals Eric as a likely suspect, though it's hardly an exact science, given that it also apparently points to Maria Valdez, the girl in the shipping department of the film company. Needless to say, Moriarty's findings are dismissed by his superiors, though to be honest, no one is really paying too much attention, as everyone somehow misses the Hopalong Cassidy lapel badge that Eric chooses to wear rather obviously to his police interrogation. By now then, Eric is becoming far more blatant, with his harassing a woman outside the YWCA further evidence of his psychological collapse. This is further amplified by the lengthy masturbation scene that follows, which is a deeply disturbing moment that once again was suggested by Dennis Christopher. In the original screenplay, Eric was due to have danced around the room with a cardboard cutout of Monroe. However, Christopher felt, quite rightly, that this was not convincing, even within the reality constructed for the film. Instead of this, then, we have a moment that is incredibly uncomfortable to watch, and which also supports the incel argument, with his angry utterance of the word bitch as he climaxes being a case in point. The final two killings happen in relatively quick succession, suggesting an escalation of chaos as Eric first kills his boss, Marty Berger, and then the corrupt film producer who has stolen his idea for a movie. Again, both repugnant characters who, if we are being honest, deserve, if not to die exactly, then certainly to get some form of comeuppance. The first of these is probably the closest that the film comes to a traditional slasher, with a masterful shot through the warehouse as Berger utters the immortal line, "Is anybody there?" followed by a hand busting through the poster of Halloween on the office wall. Though it has to be said that this scene would not have been nearly so effective had it not been, once again, for Dennis Christopher, who took one look at the costume he was supposed to wear and point-blank refused to do it. Describing the costume as Michelin Man with bandages, Irwin Yablans stepped into the fore and sent out every assistant and crew member he could to buy bandages and gauze, creating the final costume himself by quite literally wrapping up the actor as if he were a real mummy. It's a very effective costume and a very effective sequence, though one does wonder why it takes so long for Berger to turn the axe on his attacker instead of trying to chop through the fire door. As to the death of film producer Gary Bialy, who has stolen Eric's idea for a movie, one does have to wonder how much of this was Zimmerman and how much of it might have been wishful thinking on the part of Irwin Yablans. Following the success of Halloween, Yablans had already been discussing a follow-up with John Carpenter, and the two had tentatively talked about The Fog, which would eventually be released in 1980. One day, on a plane from the States to Cannes, Yablans found himself sitting next to the head of Avco Embassy, a film production company which specialized in low-budget pictures. As Yablans put it in his autobiography, quote, "We had been friendly at Paramount, where he had worked in advertising and publicity. We reminisced and gossiped during the long flight to France, and our conversation inevitably involved the phenomenal success of Halloween. I mentioned that we were following up with The Fog, and innocently let him know that it was still in the embryonic stages of discussion. I was to pay the price for my naivete." End quote. Avco Embassy would eventually beat Yablans to the punch and would end up producing Carpenter's The Fog themselves, so I cannot help but think that in the murder of Gary Bialy, gunned to death in a hair salon for stealing somebody else's movie, Yablans was executing some form of metaphorical revenge, or at the very least, some form of wish fulfillment. And wish fulfillment is indeed where the film takes us next for both Eric and Marilyn O'Connor as they create a scene from Monroe's 1957 movie, The Prince and the Showgirl. Again, this was another change from Zimmerman's script. Indeed, by this stage, we may well be asking how much of the original screenplay actually appears on the screen. The original plan was to have Eric and Marilyn recreate Monroe's famous nude photo shoot that ended up appearing in Playboy. However, Christopher felt this was too cheap for the tone of the movie, and instead they opted to recreate The Prince and the Showgirl. I have to agree that this is a very wise choice, as a nude photo shoot would have pushed the movie a little too far into sleaze, particularly following the masturbation scene. Instead, we now have a romantic and tragic moment, albeit one that is coloured by surreptitious doping with quaaludes. And once again, there is another Easter egg here for film fans. The name of the studio that Eric has hired for the occasion is Blow Up, which is a reference to the Antonioni thriller that defined the swinging 60s. As we've gathered by now, much of Fade to Black was accomplished through last-minute rewrites, so it's little wonder that writer-director Vernon Zimmerman became frustrated, though from the evidence it's hard to see how the changes were anything but improvements. This is certainly true of the film's climax, which again was a last-minute deviation from the original screenplay, though whose actual idea this was is up for debate. According to Dennis Christopher, the suggestion was his, with Eric realizing that his time was numbered and that he needed to go for a big finish, while Irwin Yablans said that it came from him and was inspired by the climax of The Hunchback of Notre Dame. Regardless of whose idea it was, it has to be said that it is the most suitable ending that the film could have arrived at, channeling not only The Hunchback of Notre Dame, but also White Heat and a little bit of King Kong. Arriving at his Palace of Dreams, the famous Grauman's Chinese Theatre, with a drugged Marilyn in tow, Eric barges his way through the crowds and into the auditorium. This leads to a very nice moment between he, Marilyn and Moriarty as Eric bangs fanatically on the film screen as if to enter the movies physically as well as spiritually. Though, it has to be said that this was greatly improvised by Dennis Christopher, and a move that greatly annoyed the owners of the theatre, who were friends of Yablans and who understandably took umbrage at the damage the actor actually did to the screen. From here, they go to the rooftop, with Eric perfecting his imitation of Jimmy Cagney's Cody Jarrett, effectively committing suicide by cop, but still managing to utter what is Cagney's most famous line, "Look, Ma, I made it. I'm on top of the world." Sadly, though, there was one final moment cut from the movie, which to my mind is a great loss. Following Eric's death plunge to the concrete, we were originally to have seen Marilyn escorted from the building, stopping to stare at his prone body as he lay spread-eagled across the handprints of the stars. Of course, this would also have been another reference to the ending of King Kong. Unfortunately, though, this was not to be, and instead we turn full circle to a tracking shot of Eric's bedroom and the movie memorabilia on the wall. It's a downbeat ending and an effective one, but I can't help but think that we lost out. Fade to Black was released in the US on October the 17th, 1980, and did respectable business, earning $15 million worldwide against a budget of $1.8 million. However, compared with the box office that many other horrors were earning at the time, this was considered a disappointment. Reviews were also rather mixed, with the film's varied tone coming in for some criticism. The New York Times wrote that although it was supposed to be a thriller, it was more amusing than scary, though they did also say that the killings are gory enough to be borderline vile, which in my opinion suggests they didn't actually see the film, as there is in fact very little gore on display at all. In sharp contrast, TV Guide suggested that the film didn't go far enough, proving the adage that you are truly damned if you do and damned if you don't. Meanwhile, the Washington Post argued that it relied too heavily on associations with older films, the clips of which it said were, quote, far more vivid and evocative than the host attraction, end quote. On a more positive note, Roger Ebert gave the film 3 stars out of 4 and praised the performances from Christopher and Kerridge, while Time Out magazine was also positive, saying that while the film references might have been obvious, the Psycho homage was, quote, almost worth the price of a ticket all by itself. However, a mixed critical reception and disappointing box office soon became the least of Yablans' problems. Shortly after the film's release, he found himself on the wrong end of a lawsuit for copyright infringement from William Boyd Enterprises in California. They alleged that the Hopalong Cassidy clips were unauthorized and that the portrayal in the film brought contempt and ridicule to both the actor and the character that he had created. The plaintiffs sought both damages and an injunction to pull the movie from theatres, though rather frustratingly, I've been unable to establish the actual final outcome. Given that the film remained on release, we can assume that the lawsuit was unsuccessful, though whether it was thrown out of court or whether an off-the-table deal was drawn up, I'm afraid to say I've absolutely no idea. With all of this to contend with, plus the difficulties with Zimmerman, it's perhaps understandable that Yablans was less than happy with the final outcome of the film, despite the great performances from Dennis Christopher, Linda Kerridge, and the rest of the cast. Quote, I wish I hadn't made that movie because I'd like to make it again. I thought the idea was so good. It comes from the concept that all of us, every one of us, our personalities and our whole persona are affected, whether we want to admit it or not, by movies. And in this way, we create ourselves as reflections of images we have either consciously or subconsciously absorbed through film. End quote. Following Fade to Black, Irwin Yablans continued to produce films both within and without the horror genre. In 1981, he released the far more conventional slasher Hell Night, featuring the star of Roller Boogie, Linda Blair, and this is a film that we mentioned briefly back in episode 51. He also served as executive producer on Halloween 2 and Halloween 3, and also on a low-budget futuristic horror called Parasite, which, despite an early role for Demi Moore, is probably best left forgotten. Now 91 years old, as of the time of recording, he has quite understandably retired from the movie business, with his final production credit appearing in the 1990 buddy comedy Men at Work, starring brothers Emilio Estevez and Charlie Sheen. Being blunt, it's not the greatest swan song for a man so influential, and I can't help but think it perhaps would have been better had he quit while he was ahead. Nevertheless, as the title of his autobiography serves to remind us, he will always be the man who created Halloween. All of which brings us on to our second film of the week, and we move away from the fantasies of a man in love with the movies to the ruthless ambition of an actress who will do anything to be in them. This is Starry Eyes, which was written and directed by Kevin Kölsch and Dennis Widmyer and released in 2014. It stars Alexandra Essoe, Amanda Fuller, Noah Segan and Fabianne Therese. If Fade to Black is about how we consume cinema, then Starry Eyes lies on the other side of the curtain, pulling back the drapes to explore how the Dream Factory operates. Allegedly, anyway. This is an incredibly rich source for cinema in general and horror in particular, and so it's not surprising that many directors have taken up the challenge. One of the more recent being Ty West with his film Maxine, the third in his X trilogy, which was released in 2024. But perhaps one of the earliest examples is the film The Death Kiss from 1932, a pre-Code movie that reunited Bela Lugosi, David Manners and Edward Van Sloan from Dracula. More of a crime drama than a horror film, this featured Lugosi as a manager in whose studio the leading man of a movie has been shot and killed, appropriately enough, while filming his character's death scene. Needless to say, the studio are eager to cover it up and pass the death off as an accident. However, it soon becomes apparent that the actor was murdered, leading to a police investigation. You can find a pretty decent copy of it available on YouTube, but be warned, it's very creaky, some of the acting is truly dreadful, and Lugosi is underutilized. It was, however, deemed interesting enough to be later used as the basis for a French movie called That's Not the Way to Die, which starred Erich von Stroheim and was released in 1946. Erich von Stroheim also pops up again in what is perhaps one of the most famous Hollywood set movies of all time. Again, not a horror, but a masterpiece of film noir, and certainly horrifying in its depiction of fading fame. This is Sunset Boulevard, released in 1950 and directed by Billy Wilder, which is now most possibly best known for its most misquoted line, "Mr. DeMille, I'm ready for my close-up," which is often repeated erroneously in a different order. This stars William Holden as a would-be screenwriter who finds himself enmeshed in the fantasy world of former silent actress Norma Desmond, played by Gloria Swanson. Often ranked as one of the greatest movies ever made, it featured cameos from director Cecil B. DeMille and gossip columnist Hedda Hopper playing themselves, and is perhaps one of the first movies to explore how easily stars, particularly women, are discarded when they fall out of favour. Despite being nominated for 11 Academy Awards and winning 3, it was not a favourite of MGM studio boss Louis B. Mayer, who loudly criticised director Billy Wilder after a private screening, telling him, quote, "You have disgraced the industry that made and fed you. You should be tarred and feathered and run out of Hollywood," end quote. To which Wilder allegedly responded, "Go fuck yourself." So perhaps his movie hit a little bit too close to Mayer's home. In any case, Sunset Boulevard is indeed a masterpiece of cinema, and if you've never seen it, then I would certainly add it to the very top of your to-be-watched list. The horrors of fading fame were also captured in Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, released in 1962, and which is now perhaps more famous for the off-screen shenanigans between stars Bette Davis and Joan Crawford. Set in a decaying LA mansion, it features Davis as a former child star, wreaking havoc towards her sister Blanche, herself a former actress left paralysed after a car accident, in much the same way as Aunt Stella in Fade to Black. Much like Sunset Boulevard, it is a must-see of classic cinema and was a huge box office hit, kick-starting the hagsploitation horror trend that would run into the 1970s. This subgenre, which arguably actually started with Sunset Boulevard, featured female stars of a certain age playing monstrous interpretations of their screen image, and would go on to include movies starring Shelley Winters, Tallulah Bankhead and Debbie Reynolds, to name just a few. That being said, this movement, and Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, were not critically well received, with the LA Times writing that Crawford and Davis had turned into grotesque caricatures of themselves, while our friends at the New York Times were equally as scathing, saying that the film's attempts at irony were feeble and that the pathos of the satire was lost under a flood of sheer grotesquerie. A few years later, 1967 gave us the Amicus anthology movie Torture Garden, which featured a story that shares some of the DNA of our second film this week. This is the installment Terror Over Hollywood, about an ambitious starlet who will do anything for fame, only to discover, spoiler alert, that the upper echelons of Hollywood are no longer human, but have been replaced by robot replicas, explaining how they stay forever young. The segment ends with our heroine being replaced by a similar robot, and her replacement is greeted by adoring fans who exclaim to each other, "Isn't she just a living doll?" Further hacksploitation followed in 1970 with the low-budget movie Hollywood Horror House, also known as Savage Intruder, which drew on both Sunset Boulevard and Baby Jane in its depiction of a faded Hollywood star living in a decaying mansion. Nowhere near as classy as its inspirations, it stars Miriam Hopkins from 1931's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde as an actress who makes the mistake of hiring a psychotic personal assistant. It's surprisingly gory for its time, and it's also pretty terrible, so it's only worth checking out from curiosity. There is, however, a YouTube channel called Dark Corners Reviews, and personally, I would advise watching his wonderfully sarcastic review instead and skipping the film altogether. Far more interesting, but still not perfect, is The Phantom of Hollywood, a made-for-TV movie from 1974 which retells the story of the Phantom of the Opera, only this time swapping the Paris Opera House for the MGM backlot. Filmed as the backlot was in the process of being torn down, much like Fade to Black, there is much here for the classic film enthusiast, though, to be honest, I wouldn't go in expecting too many surprises. Jumping forward to 1984, Brian De Palma gave us Body Double, a sleazy peek into the dark underbelly of Tinseltown that veers more towards the adult industry than it does the studio system. Heavily criticised for its depiction of violence against women, including a scene that is referenced in the novel American Psycho, it was panned by the critics of the time and was also a box office failure. It's not my favourite Brian De Palma movie by any means, and it borrows far too much from Alfred Hitchcock, but it did win Melanie Griffith's critical acclaim and a Golden Globe nomination, and it's also gone on to become something of a cult classic. A far more memorable film about Tinseltown came in 1991 with Barton Fink from the Coen brothers, surely one of their greatest films and one that I don't often hear spoken about. This stars John Turturro as the titular Barton Fink, a playwright hired by Hollywood to write screenplays for wrestling movies in the 1940s. Co-starring John Goodman, it deals with the creative process, distinctions between high and low arts, and the abuse of creatives by the Hollywood system. Perhaps the most telling moment comes when a studio executive lambasts Fink for his output, telling him that he can hire any number of other writers who can give him that Barton Fink feeling for a whole lot less trouble. Impossible to categorize, it incorporates horror, comedy, film noir, and psychological drama, a mixture which may account for its poor box office, although it did win 3 awards at the Cannes Film Festival, including Best Actor, Best Director, and the coveted Palme d'Or. Another film that did well at Cannes, and which is also pretty impossible to categorize, came in 2001 from David Lynch with Mulholland Drive. Bearing the tagline, A Love Story in the City of Dreams, it earned Lynch his 4th Oscar nomination, and also launched the career of Naomi Watts, who horror fans will probably know best from her role in The Ring a year later. Lauded by some critics and loathed by others, perhaps the most interesting review for the purposes of this episode came from the Chicago Tribune, who wrote, quote, "Everything in Mulholland Drive is a nightmare. It's a portrayal of the Hollywood golden dream turning rancid, curdling into a poisonous stew of hatred, envy, sleazy compromise, and soul-killing failure. This is the underbelly of our glamorous fantasies, and the world Lynch shows here is realistically portrayed." End quote. He would take these themes a step further, albeit in multiple different directions, with his follow-up Inland Empire from 2006. This stars Laura Dern as an actress cast in a supposedly cursed film production, who begins to take on the persona of the character she is supposed to be playing. In my opinion, possibly one of the least accessible of Lynch's movies, possibly because it's 3 hours long, it is in turns both brilliant and frustrating, and was described by the film critic from The Guardian as, quote, a meditation on the unacknowledged and unnoticed strangeness of Hollywood and of movie making in general, end quote. Meanwhile, Dennis Lim of Slate.com wrote that Inland Empire was Lynch's defiant rebuke to an industry that never fully embraced him, going on to say that it and Mulholland Drive both shared a morbid fascination with the destructive machinery of Hollywood, and that both regarded acting as a threat to the stability of the South. It's no wonder then that both Mulholland Drive and Inland Empire have been referenced multiple times in critiques of the second of this week's movies, which is the story of an actress transformed by her ambition, shot by two directors who were very much venting their own frustrations at Hollywood and the film industry. And now we are getting into the spoilers, so as always, if you haven't seen Starry Eyes yet, it's time to press pause and return once you have. Starry Eyes was written and directed by Kevin Kölsch and Dennis Widmyer, a filmmaking duo from Long Island. Their creative partnership came to be when a mutual friend in Long Island realized both were writing screenplays and facilitated an introduction. From here, they started working together on Friday nights, showing each other their scripts and bouncing ideas off one another, a working relationship that gradually became collaboration. They began making what Kölsch has called DIY films and began to build up a body of independent work, including a documentary about Chuck Palahniuk called Postcards from the Future, released in 2003, a thriller called Absence, released in 2009, and the shorts Identical Twin Sisters, again in 2009, and Exterior Life, released in 2010. By the time they got their big breakout with the release of Starry Eyes, they had been collaborating for 20 years, and along the way had experienced endless frustrations, all of which they poured into the screenplay. Not that it started off as a single screenplay. It actually began life as two separate movies being written independently by each of the duo, one a vampire story and the other a story about Hollywood. In the process of reading each other's screenplays and bouncing ideas around, they realized that they might work better as a single feature. As Widmyer explained, quote, we wanted to tell a movie about ambition, and we wanted to do a movie about transformation, and we wanted to do something original. We didn't want to do a werewolf transformation movie or a movie about the studio system. We wanted to have a very grounded approach to this sort of story. Living in LA for the past 7 years, I've met a lot of aspiring fellow filmmakers, and you see a lot of desperation and ambition. So we liked the idea of telling a metaphor with a movie that took that to the extreme. End quote. After developing the concept, the two began to finance the project through Kickstarter, something that Kölsch said came with its own set of problems and frustrations, but they did manage to raise $53,000. At this point, the project also became attached to Snowfort Pictures, a production company held by Travis Stevens, who had become friends with Widmyer through a mutual love of UFC. Stevens, who has produced horrors including A Horrible Way to Die, The Aggression Scale, We Are Still Here, and Jacob's Wife, was very intrigued by the concept and helped with its development, sharing with the directors a desire to tell a Hollywood story from a completely new perspective. After all, as he says, quote, everyone's seen the story of the town that corrupts you, end quote. Starry Eyes tells the story of Sarah Walker, an aspiring actress who works a day job at a terrible fast food restaurant called Big Taters, and who lives in an apartment block populated by others who are pretty much in the same boat. Forced to wear a truly hideous uniform a la Hooters, and hoping to eventually get a call back that will mean her big break, she is very much inspired by actors that Widmyer and Kölsch had met several years earlier, when they had been trying to get a bigger feature off the ground. Sadly, the money for that project never came through, and the movie never materialized. But seeing so many actors, through their aborted casting process, made them view the profession through a different lens, as they later explained. Quote, "You realise there's a masochistic side to actors. You're working a shitty day job, maybe a waiter or in an office, and on your lunch break you're running down the street to a studio space, reading a scene for maybe 5 minutes, and then thank you, and then you head back to work. And sometimes you never know what your impression on the casting director was. So, in a lot of ways, you're just putting yourself out there. But at the same time, there's something that's very brutal about all of that." End quote. And this, of course, is the exact position that our lead, Sarah, finds herself in. But before her situation elicits too much sympathy, what is interesting about her character and the film is that, as the story progresses, we begin to realise she isn't exactly the nicest person in the world. She's arrogant, she thinks herself above everyone, she sniggers when one of her acquaintances is injured, and is pretty ruthless in her own ambition. Not exactly what one might expect from the heroine of a movie, but of course all attributes that are pretty essential for making it in Hollywood, which is very much the point. She is also somewhat unbalanced, subjecting herself to frenzied acts of self-harm as a result of her frustrations, an activity that ends up attracting all of the wrong people, although, through Sarah's lens, we might see them as being exactly who she has been looking for. An incredibly complex character, she is played brilliantly by Alexandra Essoe in what would be her first lead in a feature, and which would serve, ironically enough, as her breakout role, something that her character Sarah quite literally kills for. Born in Saudi Arabia and raised in Toronto, Canada from the age of 12, her career was partly inspired by her mother, who was a stage actress, but also by a love of cinema. That being said, on graduating high school, she wasn't fully sure of what she wanted to do, and initially moved into modelling until she took an acting class in Toronto that she has described as being transformative. Quitting modelling and breaking up with her then partner, she moved to Vancouver and studied at an acting school for 3 years before making her screen debut in 2008 in a Canadian movie called Surviving Crooked Lake. Moving to LA to pursue her career and continue her acting studies, further small roles followed, including in the TV shows Reaper, Crash and House of Lies. However, as we can see from her IMDb page, with roles that included Girl in Waiting Room, Young Bride and Model Number 1, they were hardly roles that would get her really noticed. Nevertheless, it gave her valuable experience, both in front of and off camera, all of which would feed into her characterization as Sarah, something that she understood immediately when first reading the screenplay, saying, quote, "Sarah just leapt off the page when I read it. I felt that I knew her instantly and instinctively. There were so many things that I shared with her, especially as an actor having similar struggles. There was also this element to her that was very unhinged and very lonely. I just totally fell in love with her and felt so protective of her. It was important to me to honour her properly." End quote. Answering an ad in Backstage magazine, Essoe was one of nearly 80 actors who auditioned for the role and immediately stood out to the directors, who called her both amazing and gorgeous. Of course, though, there are many amazing and gorgeous actors working in Hollywood, so the second audition was where they really put her through her paces, as they asked her to read the audition sequence in the movie, where Sarah quite literally freaks out in front of the casting directors. In the case of Art Imitating Life, in the film, Sarah answers an ad for a low-budget horror movie, a film called The Silver Screen that is being produced by Astraeus Pictures, a production company considered dormant, which is planning their big comeback. In a scene that anticipates a similar sequence in the later Hollywood body horror The Substance, here we encounter the brutal nature of the casting process, as the male casting agent sneeringly tells Sarah that her offer to provide a new headshot will make little difference to her career. Quote, "What you do in this room right now will render that headshot null and void. When you exit this room, you will have made a lasting impression, or you will be added to an endless sea of girls who pass through these halls every day. A photograph won't change that." End quote. Sadly, Sarah initially does fall into the endless sea of girls, which probably isn't too much of a shock as her audition really isn't very much to write home about. However, it is when she vents her frustration in the bathroom, pulling at her hair and having what is described in the dialogue as a fit that her luck begins to change, for either the better or the worse, depending on your point of view. Observed by the female casting director, she is asked back into the audition room and is instructed to, quote-unquote, show off her fit, which she duly does, pulling at her hair, contorting on the floor, and losing herself completely in a moment that, as we later discover, reveals her inner darkness to a production company that is less of a studio and more of a satanic cult. This then was the very scene that Essoe was asked to perform at her second audition, and she delivered something that the directors have described as both sensational and terrifying. Even then, though, the deal was only truly sealed following a meeting a few months later with Dennis Widmyer, at which she said she decided to pull out all the stops and talk cinema, referencing films like 1981's Possession and A Woman Under the Influence, directed by John Cassavetes and released in 1974. Her knowledge and reference points impressed both directors, with Kölsch saying, quote, "She knew all the references. All the films we were going to tell her to see, she'd seen them already, and she loved them all. She never complained, and she was down to do everything. She brought a lot of her own stuff to the role, and she really elevated the role. She came in, she brought her own ideas, and added a lot of new ones to the character. She just became the character." End quote. Following her audition, Sarah returns home to the apartment she shares with her friend Tracy, and convinced that she hasn't gotten the role, stares longingly at a collage of famous faces from classic cinema, which decorate the back of her bedroom door. Much like Eric Binford, she is a fan of classic Hollywood, and there is no small amount of irony in the fact that many of the actresses she is staring at had a rather terrible time of it at the hands of the studios, another way in which Widmyer and Kölsch are taking a subtle swipe at Hollywood. Worse, however, is to come. Not only does Sarah believe she has failed her audition, but Tracy advises that their quote-unquote friends are all coming over, people with whom Sarah has little in common, and with one of whom, at least, there is no small amount of professional jealousy. This is Erin, played by Fabianne Therese, an actress who has become quite a familiar face to lovers of indie horror, having appeared in John Dies at the End in 2012, 2015's anthology movie Southbound, and more recently 2025 backwards horror Dolly, which she also executive produced. And while Alex Essoe might quite deservedly have gained all of the plaudits for her brilliantly insane performance in Starry Eyes, it must be said that Fabianne Therese puts in equally impressive work, playing an insecure aspiring actress whose jealousy manifests in passive-aggressive put-downs and a supercilious sneer. But, much as our initial impression of Sarah as a good person is wide of the mark, our initial impressions of Erin are also not entirely correct. She and the other frustrated creatives who populate the apartment building are written to deliberately shift audience sympathies towards Sarah, before the film ultimately pulls the rug out from beneath us to reveal that we have been wrong about everyone from the outset. Erin is far more empathetic and caring than she first appears, while Sarah eventually becomes a literal monster, driven by her own ambition. According to Widmyer, quote, "At the beginning of the movie, you think you're watching the girl next door, the girl fresh off the bus, that she's innocent and sweet and that she's going to be corrupted. You think you're watching that person and that all of her friends are just terrible, terrible people out to get her. And it definitely initially seems that way because the movie is very subjective." The only exception to this is would-be director Danny, played by Noah Segan, who seems to genuinely care for Sarah, even offering her a part in his upcoming low-budget movie, more on which shortly. As it turns out, Sarah's audition was indeed successful, and she receives a call from the impersonal male casting agent inviting her to a recall, though, as he ominously tells her, "This won't be the same as last time, Sarah," we are rather fearful of what is to follow next. Sarah, however, isn't so fearful. In fact, emboldened by the recall, she decides to quit her day job at Big Taters, telling her boss Carl that she is not like a million other girls and deserves far better. Carl is played by actor Pat Healy, who has had a lengthy career appearing in TV shows including CSI, Angel, Charmed, Grey's Anatomy and 24, as well as movies including Magnolia in 1999, The Innkeepers in 2011, and the brilliant disturbing thriller Compliance in 2012. He, like much of the cast, was brought in by producer Travis Stevens and gives an incredibly nuanced performance, turning a character who could quite easily have become a caricature into a man with his own hopes and ambitions. If you put yourself in Carl's shoes, says Widmyer, quote, "This is a guy who's just trying to run a business. It's his dream. It's what he believes in, and he has this girl that's coming in late, that's talking on her cell phone, that's bad at her job, and she's kind of disrespecting him. She quits, she comes back, she slaps him at work, she's sick at work. It's kind of funny when you realise that, though you're in Sarah's worldview the entire time, there are these moments where you can step outside of her world and realise that everyone is just getting caught up in her wake." End quote. After quitting her job, Sarah returns to Astraeus Pictures, a company named after the Titan Astraeus, the god of the dusk, the god of the winds, the planets and the stars, and who is sometimes known, appropriately enough, as the Starry One. Here, beneath a blinding spotlight, Sarah films a screen test, at which she is told to fully let herself go. After all, if she can't do that, how can she transform into something else? And transform she certainly does, with a series of strobe-lit jump cuts revealing her at moments becoming something monstrous and vampiric as the studio draws out the monster that lies within. When she returns home, we see further clues as to the nature of what has been drawn to the surface, as she chuckles when one of the friend group falls and breaks her nose. Like I say, she isn't a very nice person, and the reason for this is explained verbally in the following sequence when Sarah is invited to meet the head of Astraeus. When they meet, he explains the theme of the film he is making, a speech which acts as a meta-commentary on Starry Eyes itself. Quote, "Ambition, the blackest of human desires. Everyone has it, but how many act on it? That's what intrigues me. This industry is a plague, Sarah, a plague of unoriginality. Hollow be thy name, shallow be thy name. Yes, it's a plague. And what does every plague have a lot of? Rats. Thousands of them, hungry little rats, hungry for the cheese. You cut through the fog of this town, and you get desperation. Plastic parishioners, worshipping their deity of debauchery. That's what I find interesting. That's what I want to capture in the film. The ugliness of the human spirit." End quote. And as it turns out, his human spirit is pretty ugly in and of itself, as he then molests Sarah, causing her to flee from his office, and temporarily at least, kiss her dreams goodbye. Returning home, Sarah then confides in her friend Tracy, little knowing that Tracy will share the story behind her back. She also has to return to Big Taters and beg for her job back, a humiliating scene in which she has to declare herself a quote-unquote Taters girl. Depressed and angry, to say the least, she returns to the apartment complex, where her friends are having a pool party, and where she rather tellingly declares to would-be director Danny, quote, "I kind of feel like I'm selling my soul already, so it might as well be for something that I love." End quote. And here we get yet another clue as to how unpleasant Sarah really is, as Danny offers her a role in his film, one which he hopes will, quote, "capture the true spirit of independent cinema," end quote. Sarah agrees, providing that she can have the role he has already promised to Erin. Though, to be fair, that Danny agrees with this rather speedily also indicates a certain poverty in his character. Then again, maybe he's just horny. Celebrating by taking ecstasy, but still disconnected from the group and incredibly enraged by Erin, Sarah makes the incredibly smart move of making big career decisions while under the influence of drugs, and she calls Astraeus again, asking for a repeat meeting with the studio head and promising that things will be different this time. But even though she is under the influence of drugs, which is portrayed brilliantly well by Alex Essoe, it is also clear that this is her decision, an aspect that is fundamental to the plot. As Dennis Widmyer puts it, quote, "If you look at the movie, every decision she makes is her own. This is not a person who's being corrupted. We were really conscious of the fact that if you look at the movie closely, you'll see that Sarah is always in the driver's seat. If you're judging anyone, you're judging Sarah. You judge the people around her, but you'll see that they are only presenting her with options, and she's choosing the wrong one. We didn't want her to feel like a victim. The people around her are victims." End quote. Back at the studio head's mansion, Sarah enters a deal with the devil, and much as his earlier speech acts as a meta-commentary for the nature of the film we are, in fact, watching, the studio head's next dialogue foreshadows all that is to follow, as he lays out the true nature of the Faustian pact that Sarah is about to enter. Quote, "Would you forego your eyes for a new pair of eyes? Eyes that see with our vision? Would you give up your body to become a vessel for our voice, for my voice? Would you give your old life away for a glorious new life? Kill your old life and bury it in the earth, and join us in the skies." End quote. After giving him oral sex, a scene which seems to equate ambition and the desire for fame to a social disease, Sarah once again returns home, and the transformation initiated by her screen test enters full effect. From here on, the film, which has been relatively slow burn, but a dark and disturbing journey nonetheless, becomes full body horror, something that Widmyer has described as being one of the most effective subgenres of horror because there's something coming from inside you that you can't escape. His partner Kölsch has elaborated on this even further, calling Sarah's transformation a metaphor for her surrendering her self-respect to the fame industry, saying, quote, "We're just watching her old body crumbling, but in the end she's going to be rewarded with this beautiful new body that doesn't have any imperfections or concerns for others. That's sort of what the body horror was representing here." End quote. And Sarah does indeed begin to crumble, writhing on her bed every night in a fever, hallucinating, and spewing a torrent of abuse at her housemate Tracy. Quote, "How am I supposed to do something with my life when you surround me with all of these losers? You're like ants to me, like a cancer, living off of me." End quote. This despite the fact that Tracy has covered her rent for the past 2 months. Like I say, she's not very nice. She also begins to physically deteriorate, shedding her old body, literally in the case of her fingernails, and vomiting up bugs and worms, something that was achieved by Essoe literally putting mealworms in her mouth and then regurgitating them out, something for which she volunteered, though she later joked she did it because she thought it made her badass, and that in reality it was a disgusting and rough experience. And Starry Eyes is in fact a pretty disgusting movie, and I mean that in the nicest way possible. Even then though, the transformations cannot fully prepare us for the final 10 minutes, in which Sarah fulfills her bargain with the studio and brutally stabs her friends in the back. And there's a metaphor for the fame industry, if ever there was one. Beforehand though, we have a beautifully played confrontation between she and Erin, which leads to a surprising moment of empathy from the latter, when she realizes how badly sick Sarah actually is. This about-face is yet another example of how well Widmyer and Kölsch write their characters, and is also testament to Fabianne Therese's performance. Her mask of frenemy drops, and she suddenly becomes wonderfully human, just at the moment that Sarah, our supposed heroine, becomes the exact opposite. I won't list every murder here in detail, but needless to say, they come in quick succession and are unbelievably brutal, with some excellent sound design and effects work leading to some genuinely wince-inducing moments. Rarely have I seen a series of stabbings so protracted or heard any sound as convincing, and as for the dumbbell murder, jaw-dropping doesn't even begin to cover it. Unfortunately though, the only wrinkle in my enjoyment of the movie comes at this precise moment, with the ritual performed out in the hills now that Sarah has delivered her sacrifice. Personally, I could do without the fluorescent lanterns and the glowing lights laid above Sarah as she's buried in the earth, and it's the only aspect of the film where the low budget bubbles to the surface, looking very much at odds with the rest of the movie. Admittedly, in the wider context of the film, it's a minor wrinkle, but it's a wrinkle nonetheless. Starry Eyes is, of course, a metaphor, a story in which studios are demonic, ambition turns you into a monster, and to succeed requires the destruction of the self while stabbing your friends in the back, or the face, or the stomach, repeatedly and with great vigour. And if you can't manage that, then a well-aimed dumbbell to the face will do just as nicely. By the end of the picture, Sarah has indeed become the star she always knew she would be, with no concern for the consequences of her actions, a trail of bodies behind her, and a big smile on her face as she looks forward to a life of stardom. For those she left in her wake, it is a nightmare, but for Sarah, it's a happy ending. Beginning life as a Kickstarter campaign and filmed over just 18 days, Starry Eyes premiered at the South by Southwest Film Festival in Austin, Texas on March the 8th, 2014. It immediately attracted a buzz, described by Time magazine as the kind of film you would get, quote, if David Lynch and David Cronenberg came together to craft a gory, psychological mind-bender, end quote. From there, it hit the festival circuit, where reaction was slightly more mixed. Variety praised Essoe's performance and the energy and the compelling plot, but found the ending, quote-unquote, overcooked, while Slant magazine once again compared it to Cronenberg and Lynch, but this time less favourably. The same can also be said for reviews following the theatrical release in November of the same year. The New York Times and The Hollywood Reporter were negative, but the website RogerEbert.com awarded the film 3 out of 4 stars, saying that, quote, it may leave you feeling hopeless, but its bleak vision of masochistic perfectionism is clear-eyed, cogent, and devastatingly unsettling, end quote. One constant, though, was the praise for Alex Essoe, and ironically, much as the film within a film is a gateway role for the character of Sarah, Starry Eyes became a breakout role for its lead, who has since built up an impressive body of work, including as one of Mike Flanagan's recurring troupe of actors, with roles in Dr. Sleep, The Haunting of Bly Manor, Midnight Mass, and The Midnight Club. More recently, she starred in the 2025 horror Pitfall and currently has 3 films in post-production, all horror or horror adjacent: Mrs. Ladderdy, The Avalanche, and Los Silencios. Kevin Kölsch and Dennis Widmyer also continued in the horror genre, following Starry Eyes with an installment of the anthology movie Holidays released in 2015. After this, they hit the mainstream, with episodes of Scream, the TV series, and the 2019 remake of Pet Sematary. They currently have 2 films in post and pre-production, which are respectively The Swallow, following 5 teenagers abandoned in a deadly forest, and Thriving, an Ibiza-set horror following a woman unraveling as the island paradise becomes hell. Given the film that made their name, I am certainly going to be looking out for this one with a great deal of interest. Fade to Black and Starry Eyes are both films about the horrors of the movie business, presenting highly cynical perspectives of Hollywood and centering around incredibly unreliable protagonists. One might be a crazed obsessive and the other a desperate actress, but each is driven to destruction by an overwhelming belief in the mythology of the film business. Fade to Black blames the movies for violence, and Starry Eyes presents those who make them as monstrous. Together, the two remind us that the Hollywood dream is really nothing more than an illusion, and that to believe in it too much, either as a fan or a participant, could cost you your sanity, or indeed, your very soul. All of which brings me to the end of this week's episode, so thank you very much for listening. If you've enjoyed the show, please remember to rate, review and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. And please remember, you can always email thehorrordoublebill@gmail.com or follow our Instagram account, thehorrordoublebill. Next week, we are celebrating the arrival of summer in the Northern Hemisphere with 2 films set in sunny climes, quite literally in the first case. This is The Day the Earth Caught Fire from 1961, directed by Val Guest and starring Edward Judd, Janet Monroe, Leo McKern and Michael Goodliffe. And then we follow this with our first Australian movie on the podcast, which is Long Weekend from 1978. This is directed by Colin Eggleston and stars John Hargreaves and Bryony Bietz. If you'd like to watch along, you can find out where these films are streaming in your area by visiting justwatch.com. And if they're not available in your country and you have a VPN, you can also see where they might be playing in other regions. So, I'll be back next week for the discussion, and until then, thank you very much for listening and have a really great week. Goodbye.